Take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
So Joe Rogan had on Senator Bernie Sanders once again on his podcast. This is the second or third time that he's been on there. So I gave this a listen. Bernie has gotten criticism before for being on this program at all, although it's not an election cycle, so I doubt that'll happen. He was also on Flagrant recently, which is Andrew Schultz's podcast, and had a conversation with them. I talked about that a little bit. And he did get some criticism about that I saw, but mild, small amounts. And so Joe had Bernie on. He's always been fond of Bernie. He said he would have voted for Bernie multiple times and has always been supportive of Bernie's policies, although ever since he first said that, his politics have changed quite a bit. And so he's still friendly to Bernie. He still talks positively about, Bernie-style politics whenever it comes up. However, it's unclear if the election was between Bernie and Trump today, and Joe Rogan had the decision to make based on his current ideas about policy, I'm not sure that he would necessarily go for Bernie. He has drifted to the right quite a lot. And this conversation illustrates a little bit of why, I think, because while there is general agreement between Joe and Bernie on issues like social safety net, and AI, the threat of AI, and even, corporate greed and oligarchy and that sort of thing. Joe Rogan is willing to vaguely agree in those directions. However, over the years, he has subjected himself to a lot of people that have filled his head with alternate versions of reality that paint a justification for a more right-leaning politic. So in some cases, he has fully embraced that right-leaning politic and embraced right-wing policies. In other cases, he hasn't quite gone that far. But even though he hasn't, said, I support gutting the social safety net, or at another point in this interview, he says, I don't support full privatization of government, and we'll get to that later. But he has begun to accept the premises that lead to those conclusions. And that is why it's just purely how misinformed this guy is. And that definitely is on display in this interview. I think Bernie didn't do a great job at pushing back on him in this interview. There were only a couple moments of disagreement. And, I think Bernie's not really going on there to debate or argue with him. And what he did do a good job of is steering the conversation so that, like, when Joe kind of threw a weird thing in there, Bernie would kind of like sidestep it and keep going with the point. But I also found this conversation was a little bit mushy, I guess, meaning that like it's kind of a typical Joe Rogan conversation where he's just kind of talking about like the nature of humans and society, man. And it's just so weird. And it's like there's no, it kind of has just that vague pontificating kind of feeling. They talk about a lot of problems, not a lot of solutions, which is a little disappointing because Bernie is a senator. He ran for president with a platform to address some of these issues. And he does get into it a little bit. Obviously, like there's some details to some of these policies, but in a long form discussion, it would have been nice for Joe Rogan's audience to be exposed to, like really detailed ideas about how government could be done differently. So I think that's a little bit of a missed opportunity here, and Joe Rogan gets away with some classic Joe Rogan bullshit. So let me play the first clip here, and then later we'll get to some more exciting news. Zohran Mamdani won the New York primary yesterday on Tuesday, so that's excellent. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but first let's watch this clip of Joe Rogan and Bernie Sanders talking about climate change.
The other thing that I would do, and you got to deal with this climate change issue. And I know that there are some people who think climate change is a hoax. It ain't a hoax. I think the last 10 years have been the warmest on record. And we can create millions of good-paying jobs transforming our energy system away from fossil fuel to energy efficiency to solar to wind and other sustainable energies.
Did you see the Washington Post piece that they wrote where they did this long-term view? First of all, the reality is that the Earth's temperature has never been static, right? We could both agree on that. It's always been up and down. There's been ice ages and heat waves. And then the Washington Post looked at it. What was the time period that they looked at? That essentially they found that we're in a cooling period. That the Earth over the past X amount of years, and this was like a very inconvenient discovery, but they had to report the data, and kudos to them for doing that. Scientists have captured the Earth's climate change over the last 485 million years. Here's a surprising place we stand now. So look at the far end of that graph, and you see we're in a cooling period.
Well, I'm not sure. I didn't read that article, but
Yeah.
the scientists who are out there, I think.
I know, but there's a lot of money involved in that too, Bernie. That's part of the problem. There's a lot of money involved in this whole climate change emergency issue, and there's a lot of control.
All I can tell you is that we are, in my view, going to see more extreme weather disturbances in the coming years than we have ever. And we're seeing them right now.
Right, but scientists don't agree. Well, this is where it gets confusing, because scientists that are in agreement, there's all these entanglements. Whenever someone's discussing something, whether it's economics or whether it's health issues or pharmaceutical drugs, there's financial entanglements. I think we both agree with that, right?
Yep.
And I think this is part of the issue with this whole climate change emergency as well, because it's not just that we could all agree pollution is a major factor. It's a huge issue in the world today. We could all agree with that, right? I think one of the things that we have to recognize is that whenever there's an issue that everyone can agree on, you're going to have a bunch of people that capitalize on that issue, and they look to gain more money. They have financial issues that they push forward in order to capitalize on this issue, but then also power and control. These things like they're trying to institute in the UK, where they have these 15-minute cities, this concept where you're not allowed to travel. They'll be able to look at your carbon footprint. See, that's the problem. The problem is giving people that are in power, these people that we've all discussed that have so much money and so much control over our societies, multinational corporations, giving them more control over citizens.
So, pretty straightforward, just idiocy from Joe Rogan here. Bernie doesn't really catch it here. And like I said, just doesn't do a great job at pushing back on Joe in this conversation, honestly, although I guess that wasn't really what he was there for. But so this graph that Joe pulls up, that shows tracks the Earth's climate over time. This is on a span of like hundreds of millions of years, first of all. And the first point, I'm showing this graph right now, the first point on the graph is 25 million years. That's the closest to the end where Joe is pointing to and saying that we're in a cooling period, which is true. So it trends down there at the end, and then you see that it spikes back up right there, right at the end. What could that be right there? What you're actually seeing there is the beginning and potential end of human society based on what the climate allows for. So this is the kind of complete lack of discernment that Joe Rogan has become famous for. He has exposed himself and his audience to over the years, and still to this day, after endless amounts of criticism, still just completely thoughtlessly pumps out this idea that climate change is a panic, an unnecessary panic, because the Earth is in a cooling period right now, despite the fact that you can clearly see in this graph that human society only comes about at the end when the climate has cooled to a certain point. And we are quickly heating the climate back up to a point that is unsurvivable. I mean, that is obvious. Literally just looking at this graph, you can see that. I'm not an expert on this shit. I've never seen this graph before until he showed it. It's very clear that that's what you're looking at. But obviously Joe, who does not have the discernment to look at a graph like that in the Washington Post and accurately understand what he's looking at. Clearly, this was communicated to him by somebody else, somebody on his timeline, somebody that he knows, somebody that sent him something. But clearly, this was communicated to him as well. The Washington Post just published a graph that actually disproves climate change, if you can believe it. This is an inconvenient, but kudos to them for putting it out. But I love the idea of downplaying climate change to just like everybody understands that pollution is bad. Like, yeah, okay, bro, whatever. But then he gets into this stuff about entanglements and money and how money is wrapped up in whatever, the solutions to climate change. And so that's why you can't trust what these climate people, these climate scientists are saying. And I've heard this a lot. I've heard this from people in my own family going back years. This is a common refutation of the science on climate change, is to just attack the credibility of all scientists who are saying that. It's patently absurd, because if you compare the amount of money that supposedly would be or is in green energy versus the amount of money that is actually in fossil fuels, there's no comparison there. And one of those industries actively runs the world right now. And the people that run and control that supply system are some of the most undisputably powerful people in the world, all across the world. So the idea that it flips to the other side and you say, well, you got to be careful with these climate scientists because they're out to make a buck. Rather than, as they discuss multiple times in this interview, that companies like sugar companies, tobacco companies, will put out fake science or lie about science in order to protect the reputation of their company. Joe Rogan knows this. He literally says it in this interview. And yet, because of his lack of discernment, his ability to repeat things that have been said to him, but his lack of ability to discern things for himself, he cannot make this distinction between who the powerful people in the world actually are. And I think he is smart enough to know that he is smart enough that he has come to that conclusion before, probably not even that long ago for the last time. But whatever his incentive and his financial entanglements are in the things that he feels like he wants to be saying on his platform are preventing him from coming to the conclusion that obviously the people who are controlling the most amount of money and the most valuable product are the ones who have the most power. This is a very simple conclusion to draw that many people who are allergic to critique of capitalism will not draw. So they convince themselves that different sources of power are on an equal playing field with just the raw power of aligning yourself with whatever makes you the most money. And given that Bernie's whole tour is about trying to point that out, trying to point out the oligarchy to people, it's possible this conversation could have been more about capitalism. Even though I can see why he might want to avoid terms like that in conversation with Joe, I think that would have been a more interesting conversation and a more incisive conversation. But anyway, moving on to this next clip, Joe actually says something interesting here. They're talking about AI and how AI is going to change the landscape of work and life in general, and how our ideas about what it looks like to work and what it looks like to exist in society are going to have to change eventually, whether it's because of this wave of AI or future waves of automation. It looks like in the future, more and more things are going to be automated and people are going to have less to do. So in talking about that, Joe Rogan actually gets pretty close to some capitalist critique. So let's listen to that.
Instead of thinking them as workers, should we think of them as, look, there are people that make the decisions. There's the executives. There's the corporation itself. But without the people that worked on those assembly lines, you have nothing.
That's right.
You have nothing. You couldn't have done any of the things you've done without those people. But those people are replaceable because it's skilled labor that you could teach another person to do, and they're replaceable because there's plenty of people that want those jobs and there's a demand. So you file them in, you file them out, which is why they developed unions, right? So they developed unions to keep people from being exploited.
Right.
And then the problem becomes the unions get exploited, and then the unions have a lot of money, and then there's a lot of influence, and then they decide, okay, fuck these unions, let's go to Mexico.
Okay, so he almost had it there. And he starts by saying some of the most interesting shit that I've heard him say, which is that instead of calling these people workers, instead of talking about them as workers, we should talk about them as the people who create the value. That's the labor theory of value. So, I mean, that is like fundamental to socialism right there, what he's talking about. It is a building block to the idea of socialist and communist revolution. So obviously Joe Rogan would never take it to that conclusion. However, there is something very fundamental that he's getting at that he's able to identify here. However, then he, on his diatribe, he talks about unions, which is great. Okay, we're talking about democracy in the workplace, and we're talking about workers building power in a way that challenges capital power, right? So we're almost getting somewhere interesting in this conversation. But then he says that, but then the unions get exploited, and then the companies say, okay, fuck these unions, we're going to Mexico. Meaning like sending factory jobs to places where labor is cheaper. And so it really falls apart at the end there, because when he says there's actually a straight line between those things that he's talking about, the only thing that gets in the way is unions get exploited. What does that mean? By who? Unions get exploited by the corporations? Because that would be a problem. Except that's not what's happening, because even he says that then the corporations go to Mexico to get away from the unions. So who's exploiting the unions? You're saying the workers are exploiting the union? That's kind of the point. So I'm not saying union corruption isn't a thing, but I'm saying that the line he's drawing doesn't cover that. And instead, he kind of just gets himself confused about how all of this stuff works. And, you know, once again, this is the result of somebody who has been thinking about this stuff for a long time, but is continually filling his head with obfuscations and things that are distracting him from coming to the main conclusion, which is that corporations are able to offshore their jobs and escape union pressure because they are able to rig the government to allow them to do it. If unions had more power and corporations had less, corporations would not be able to get around union demands, which in many cases in America, they aren't. So the cases where unions are doing the best in America is the cases where corporations are not able to just leave the country or do something else to get around the union labor standards. And so in the cases of electricians and plumbers and plenty of other services that get done well throughout America, there are high standards for treatment of workers and payment of workers. And when corporations are able to avoid that, they do it. And the reason they're able to do it in America is because corporations control the government. That's what this conversation is about. Easy conclusion to come to. Joe Rogan can't muster the ability. But that leads us to this last clip about taxes. And here is where Bernie pushes back a little bit on what Joe is saying, and it starts to come together a little bit why Joe is unable to come to the right conclusion on some of these issues.
Look, I'd be more than willing to pay more taxes if we lived in a better country. I'd be like, this would be great. If I felt like if I pay more
then
taxes,
your job is,
everybody's surviving, everybody's doing well, that's great.
All right. Then that is the issue of how you revitalize American democracy. I'm not going to argue with you that the system today is pretty bad. All right, I live it. I'm going there today.
And ironically, it's bad because there's no competition, right? It's corrupt, but it's not a free market. Like the government itself has a monopoly on governing. And when they're completely corrupt and when they're making insane amounts of money through taxes and they're not accountable.
No, all right, no, I don't. No, this is the way I see it.
But by the way, I'm not advocating for making it privatized, making all of government privatized. I'm just talking about the realities of corruption in our current government system.
Let's talk about what we mean by corruption. I do not believe, by the way, because I know these guys, some of them are corrupt.
Let's say incompetent and waste.
Okay. All right, let's
we can take fraud out of the equation and just talk about incompetency and waste.
The corruption is, in my view, that government is very far removed from the needs of ordinary people because it is largely controlled by billionaires in both political parties who have their agenda.
Yes.
All right. One of the things that I do, what my campaigns for president were about, what I'm doing right now, we're doing what we call a fighting oligarchy tour, that's why I'm in Texas, is to try to say to people out there who are mostly working class people, You got to get involved. I know it's hard. People are working long hours. You got to get involved in the political process. You got to make demands on government that it serves you, not just the very wealthy.
Yeah, fascinating view of corruption here from Joe Rogan. What he's saying here is that government is able to be so inefficient and so corrupt because there's no competition. There's no competition for government. So that means that government is able to get away with being incredibly wasteful, whereas like capitalist entities have to be less wasteful and faster moving because they have to be competitive. This is the idea of capitalism, right? So this is what happens when you listen to people like Mark Andreessen and Elon Musk, and you have them in your space to, uncritically air out their worldview, is they fill your head with bullshit like this. Because what Joe Rogan is talking about makes absolutely no sense. The idea that there would be competition in government for one single place that's known as like civil war, or like what you would call a failed state. Like that's not really how you operate a society. The way you operate a society is to have one agreed upon form of government that creates the maximum benefit for everybody in the society. Very hard thing to do. Lots of disagreements about the right way to do it. Some people don't believe that any structure like that should exist at all because of how hard it is to create a society and a government that benefits everybody. But this idea that the government, somebody in the government, is making insane amounts of money through taxes. And so he's literally looking at people who work in the government at whatever various level, anybody from like Donald Trump to some random bureaucrat that Donald Trump fires. He's looking at them as like finance bros and like tech CEOs who are literally raking in millions and billions of dollars in profit. And so he's applying that same image in his brain to people who work in the government because yes, there's tons of money that comes through the government. But the idea that there's people who are just raking it in and keeping that, it shows that there's absolutely no understanding of what corruption looks like at all. Joe Rogan doesn't understand what corruption means at all. And again, it's because he's listening to people like Elon Musk who are the face of corruption. Elon Musk, most of his money is made through government contracts. That's what corruption looks like. Money comes into the government through taxes, and then through contracts, we give it to somebody who's supposedly doing the government and the people at large a service. So if your government is reappropriating funds in a way that is benefiting private businessmen or some powerful person who did something, that is corruption. But to not tie that to a system of capitalism where people are creating the conditions where they can control the market, have a monopoly, and ironically, in Joe Rogan's words, not have any competition to prevent them from exploiting the government and making the maximum amount of money in that field at the expense of the taxpayer. That's corruption. The fact that Joe Rogan does not have that simple conception in his head is very frustrating. It's very stupid. It's on us, guys. Everybody from Bernie Sanders to me, to you, to everybody else who's ever dedicated themselves to a left-wing cause. The fact that more people are not aware of the basic idea of having a government that works well is on us. So, on that note, some good news before I go. Zohran Mamdani won the mayoral primary for the Democratic Party in New York City. He beat Andrew Cuomo. He stomped Andrew Cuomo, actually. This was a decisive victory. Zohran won overwhelmingly in places he wasn't expected to win. The turnout was crushing for Cuomo. Cuomo conceded early. This was ranked choice voting, and Zohran Mamdani won on the first round. What that means is ranked choice voting is set up so that there's multiple rounds, so that the votes and the different ranked choices that you have on your ballot are evenly distributed based on who has the best chance to win. So there's multiple rounds of counting where the people who get the least top choice votes get knocked out, and then the votes from those ballots get redistributed. And it's a fair system that allows more people like Zohran Mamdani to compete, but this had nothing to do with ranked choice voting. Zohran Mamdani crushed Cuomo fair and square. This is excellent news. Does not mean he's the mayor yet, but things are looking a little different now. I mean, it's been looking like an uphill battle this whole time, and Cuomo could still run as an independent if he wants to, although I doubt it now. But, is an independent, let alone Eric Adams, going to beat the Democratic nominee in a mayoral race in New York City? I don't know that he is. He could. Crazier things have happened. But I don't know that Eric Adams is the one to pull it off. Zohran Mamdani has a ton of momentum right now. Let's just hope he keeps it up. So let's keep the support going strong and keep talking about Zohran Mamdani, and let's pull out this win, because it really would be a transformative win for the progressive movement in America. And it would remind people, from Donald Trump to the leaders of the Democratic Party, that the left-wing, socialist, and progressive movement is the only way forward in this country post-Trump. There's no other option. It's the only way forward. So let's continue to prove that. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. And if you really want to support, consider becoming a member. That's the best way to support this channel. I'm posting different kinds of stuff there, like podcasts that don't make it to the main channel, book reviews, movie reviews. I'm reading Catcher in the Rye right now. I'm probably going to review that on there. Also posting music early. I've got a couple EPs out that were available first for members only. Right now, there's a couple tracks on there. There's a freestyle by me and my buddies Wrecked and Psych. So if you want access to all that, different podcasts and other stuff, become a member. And if there's other kinds of content that you'd like to see for members only stuff, then let me know and we'll work some things out.